So in this section, we'll be talking about updating and installing software on Ubuntu. But before we talk about that, we need to talk about how open source software works, things like how it's turned into binaries and what repositories or repos are, and a little bit of the theory surrounding that. So this will be quick. First, if you're a Linux or Unix system administrator, you'll be working primarily with open source software. There are exceptions to this, but that actually makes it simpler, not more complicated. Software is really written in plain text files. If you've never written code before, it's simply plain text files, which are written in whatever programming language the software is written, and then compiled. So those plain text files are compiled, and that spits out a binary or an executable file. That is a file which your operating system can run to run that program. So for example, you'll go from a plain text source files, and through the compilation process, you'll end up with a binary that is the htop program. And when you run that binary, you get the htop program. Most modern Linux distributions have servers that save you from that compiling step. That is, they pick some default compilation sort of options and settings, and they compile all the popular software that their users want, and they stick that up on a server so that anyone that wants it can save themselves the compilation step, right? It makes sense because, I mean, why have 10,000 or 100,000 or a million people all compile the same software with tiny little differences in the options they select, instead of saving all that CPU time and all that human time and simply compiling it once and then serving that compiled binary to all those people with a simple download. It saves often something like 90% of the time, especially for larger software packages that can take hours to compile. Okay, so there's some exceptions to this. The more BSD-like systems, the more Unix-like Linux distributions like Gentoo, you're basically going to compile everything from source yourself on your machine. That means updates are things that can take days to happen occasionally. Arch has a ports-like system. FreeBSD ports inspired some of these mechanisms. But for the most part, when you're working, you're going to be using distributions like Red Hat Linux or Ubuntu Linux or Debian Linux, distributions which provide precompiled packages for you. Those are called repositories. So they have a repository of precompiled software. Make sense? It's fairly simple. You've got source code that gets turned into binaries, and most popular Linux distributions, to save people time, simply precompile source code to provide binaries to their users, which just saves time. Collections of those binaries are called repositories or repos. So let's talk about updating software on Ubuntu. First, the root user is the one that's able to make changes to the system. We'll talk a little bit more about that root user later, but basically the root user, as I've mentioned before, is God on your Linux or Unix system. The root user can make changes to the system, install new software, modify important files, and normal users generally don't have this right, although they can be given rights to specific configuration files or devices, that sort of thing. The su and sudo or sudo commands are used to run a command, as in superuser do, that is, do this following command as the superuser, to change to the root user just for one command or permanently. And that lets you do things like updating your repositories and upgrading software. Aptitude is the program which Debian and its derivatives use to update the repository listing and upgrade software. The utilities which you use with the Aptitude program are generally prefixed with apt, so that's things like apt-get update fetches new updates, so you can see what software has been updated since the last time you ran that command. And apt-get upgrade will simply upgrade the binaries on your system with new versions from the repositories. So let's say a couple days have passed since your last apt-get update and upgrade, and there have been some security vulnerabilities in a piece of software that you use. Let's say it's the Nginx web server. You fetch the updates and you see that there's a new version available, and the upgrade command would simply upgrade your local version to the most up-to-date version in the repository. The -y, we'll get to that in a bit, but basically it just says, don't ask me, just go ahead and upgrade. It's sort of a force upgrade. And that's useful for when you're scripting. That'll be one that you use a lot when you're writing scripts because you don't want to wait for a prompt. You'll see what I mean in a second. Then we're going to talk about installing new software, which is done also with aptitude, and that's apt-get install. And you can see the Y option there too if you're scripting. So you simply apt-get install and then some software name. You can also remove software that way, apt-get remove some software name. And this one's useful. There are a lot more apt tools and things you can do, like apt cache policy and different things, but apt cache search is a really important one. If you're not sure of the name of a piece of software that you're searching for, you can simply do apt cache search and then search for some approximate thing that you think is probably in there, and it will display all the software that might match your search terms. And then we'll actually go ahead and install the software we need for this project. We'll do that in the next video. So let me just quickly show you updating software on Ubuntu. I have two examples here. This is the graphical user interfaces software updater feature, which automatically in the background checks for updated software, alerts you when it's available, and then gives you the option to install it now. We're actually going to click Remind Me Later because we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. This is the way which we'll have available to us on our server. So I'm going to go ahead and type in sudo apt-get update. I'll explain the sudo and the super user in just a second. It'll prompt you for your password, and then it'll go and you can see these are all the repositories that it's going out and fetching. So I just want to demonstrate, if I leave out that sudo, I'm hitting Control W right now just to delete the last word. This is going to give me an error. Error, could not open the lock file, permission denied. That's because I am the Dave user right now, and as I mentioned before, only the root user can modify important system files and do things like software updates. Just to illustrate this, if I type in who am I, it's a nice little command to show my current username. But if I type in sudo who am I, I'm going to get root back, because sudo basically says please do the following command, who am I, as the super user, that is root. So when I say please run who am I as root, obviously the root account will be running that, the root user, and it'll come back as root. So Dave is a normal user and is not allowed to do things like mess with these lock files or grab a new list from Ubuntu, but root is allowed to do that. So for now, when you need to do sort of system things, you'll simply say sudo apt-get upgrade. I'm using the shortcut which I discussed earlier, Control E to get to the end here, and we actually want the upgrade command. This is the one where I was mentioning -y if you're absolutely sure that you want to script this and not be prompted, but we want to see what's going on here under the hood. So sudo apt-get upgrade. I'm going to run that, and this should give you the upgrades which are available, which you can go ahead and install with a yes or decline with a no. And if you choose yes, your system will simply download the updates for all the updatable binaries on your system, install those, and if necessary, like if you've done a Linux kernel update, it'll prompt you for a reboot. Otherwise, just restarting the piece of software that was updated should be enough. The nice thing about most Linux distributions is instead of having to hunt for individual updates for every single program that you have installed, as you do on, say, Mac OS or Windows, if you're installing things through a package manager, like Aptitude, your system will automatically know when there's an upgrade available for anything you've got installed. So we're going to abort this for now, and in the next video I'm going to show you how to do this on your VPS, which we'll be using for the rest of the project to actually get your WordPress site and hosting platform set up and running. So in the next video we'll basically use everything we learned here to get all of our requirements installed on our server. I'll see you there.